Welcome back, True Crime Army. I am your host, Margot, and you are listening to Military Murder, a true crime podcast that's been going strong for 6 years and counting. Military Murder is a show where I tell you cases involving military members and veterans, all with one goal in mind, to remind you to remain vigilant always. A few years back, I started an episode called Headlines, where I bring you right now in the news stories to reinforce that we have to be cautious always. And after last week's episode, I guess I need to remind everyone to lock your doors and your windows because people are crazy out in these streets. And you know, I take my own warnings as well. Recently, in my own gated community, someone's car was robbed in the middle of the day during the week. I'm talking sun high in the sky, 12 p.m. A homeowner's security camera captured a car drive by and then circle back, stop close to a gardening truck. The passenger exited the vehicle, crouched down, and then opened the door of the gardening truck that was parked in the street. The man then got inside, shuffled in the front seat, got back into the SUV passenger seat, and then they took off. We later learned that the gardener's wallet was stolen, as well as a pretty chunk of change in cash. My mouth was on the floor watching this video in our group chat. The criminal was ballsy because the gardener was actually just behind that home mowing the lawn. But that's how quick things happen. And in addition to this story, just the other day, I was driving one of my daughters to an appointment. And as I was waiting to make a U-turn, a car stopped almost like right next to me, but more like behind me. And the person opened their door and they were arguing with the car that was right behind me. I immediately went into mama bear mode because my daughter was in that back seat. I got the hell out of Dodge. I went straight because I didn't know what was going to go down. And quite honestly, maybe that makes me sound like a crazy person. But I don't mess around, especially not with people and their road rage, and especially not when it involves my children. No, thank you. Anyway, today I am bringing you my first headline episode of the year. So let's get into it. Today I have 6 stories for you. One is closing the loop on a story that I brought you 6 months ago. And as always, just a reminder that in these cases, all persons are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Regardless if they have been charged, they are innocent until it's proven. With that, let's get into it.
Military murder is an independent project and is not endorsed by the Department of Defense or any military component. The views expressed are those of the host. The content of this podcast is not meant to be legal or medical advice. Warning, this episode contains graphic details of murder and is not suitable for young listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
A Vietnam veteran who was an alleged serial killer will have his remains removed from this Texas cemetery.
We're going to turn now to new information in a deadly shooting at the Target on Abercorn Street. News 3 has now learned the identities of the 2 men involved.
Across the state, a Fort Hood soldier sentenced to 26 years in prison after pleading guilty.
After more than a year of investigating, federal prosecutors say the former secretary at Idaho's American Legion stole more than $1.4 million from the veterans nonprofit.
22-year-old Taylor Lomax faces 2 counts of second-degree murder and is being held without bond after Clay County Sheriff's deputies allege he shot and killed 21-year-old Noely Makenda and 20-year-old Jordyn Forrestier.
Nearly 30 years after the body of a woman who came to be known as Peaches was found on Long Island, her suspected killer appeared before a Florida judge today. Law enforcement sources say 66-year-old Andrew Dykes was arrested yesterday on murder charges near Tampa.
My first Headlines episode today is closing the loop on a Headlines case that I reported on in my June 2025 Headlines segment. And it's a case out of Fort Hood involving a dual military couple. You might remember I told you about Staff Sergeant Sgt Gitau Mwangi and how he was charged with the shooting death of his wife, Sgt Esther Gitau. Well, in December of 2025, Mwangi pled guilty. Mwangi's plea and sentencing came on December 12, 2025, at the Lawrence Williams Judicial Center at Fort Hood, where a military judge accepted his admission of guilt to the charge of unpremeditated murder in connection with the fatal shooting of his wife. Mwangi was subsequently sentenced to 26 years in prison. He was ordered to forfeit all pay and allowances, reduced in rank to E1, and dishonorably discharged from the United States Army. The events that led to this devastating outcome unfolded on the night of February 21st, 2025, at the couple's home in Killeen, Texas. According to military officials and court records, Mwangi and Sgt Gitau were engaged in an argument that escalated into violence. During that dispute, Mwangi shot his wife several times, leaving her gravely wounded inside the home. After the shooting, Mwangi left the residence and called his brother from his car, reportedly admitting what he had just done. The brother then contacted authorities who responded to the home on Lake Crest Drive, and that's where they found Sgt Gitau suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. She was later pronounced dead. Inside the home at the time of the shooting were the couple's 2 young children, who, according to police, were unharmed and reportedly unaware of what had just occurred. Sgt Esther Gitau was 37 years old, and she was an active-duty Army soldier assigned to the 1st Medical Brigade at Fort Hood. That's where she worked as a food safety inspector. Her military career included previous assignments at Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia, and Fort Knox, Kentucky, reflecting a life of service that took her across branches and installations. She was remembered by colleagues and family for her dedication to duty, her role as a mother, and her commitment to Army values. And sadly, as this chapter closes with a guilty plea and a 26-year sentence, let's remember the kids, because at the end of the day, they are victims. In one instant, they lost both their mother and their father. This next case takes us to Georgia, and it is simply senseless. On Sunday, January 4th, 2026, what should have been an ordinary afternoon errand turned into a tragic and senseless loss of life in Savannah, Georgia. At around 4:10 p.m., emergency calls came into the Savannah Police Department reporting gunfire in the parking lot of the Target store in Abercorn Street. When officers arrived, they found a man suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. The man was rushed by EMS to Memorial Health University Medical Center, but tragically, he would later succumb to his injuries. That man, the victim, was later identified as Matthew Traywick, a husband, father of 3 young children, and a respected member of his community. Traywick's loss has sent shockwaves through Savannah. Friends described him as a devoted father and provider whose life was brutally cut short in an incident that, really on the surface appears to have started over something as trivial as a parking space dispute. A dispute so ordinary that most of us have experienced it at one time or another. Yet, in this case, it ended in deadly violence. I will say that I do not fight over parking spots anymore. I park in the back, I mind my own business, I don't care if I have to walk a few blocks, I'm getting in my steps because it's just not worth it. By the way, the facts surrounding what actually happened in this particular case are unclear. Was there an argument over who was coming and going, how someone parked, if someone dinged someone's car? We really don't know. But what we do know is that the person who fired those shots that killed Traywick stuck around. Savannah police quickly identified and arrested the suspect at the scene. It was 30-year-old Tyler Edward Linn. Linn was taken into custody without incident, and he remains held at the Chatham County Detention Center, charged with murder and aggravated assault. At the time of this reporting, Linn had not entered a plea, and the full legal process is just beginning. And guess what? Tyler Linn is a United States Army veteran. According to both Savannah officials and military sources, Linn served from August of 2015 until October of 2023. During that time, he was stationed at Hunter Army Airfield, located in Savannah, where he worked as an unmanned aircraft systems repairer. He left the Army after serving 8 years at the rank of specialist. At this point, there is no public indication that the victim and suspect knew each other prior to this deadly encounter. Now, police have not confirmed exactly what was said during the dispute or what, if anything, triggered the use of lethal force. Those are questions that investigators and eventually the courts will need to answer. Local officials, including Savannah Mayor Van Johnson, have been vocal in condemning the violence. In statements released through social media and press, Johnson said, quote, "No disagreement over a parking spot or anything else should ever end in the loss of life," end quote. He went on to call the shooting needless, unnecessary violence that only highlights the ongoing challenges facing cities in combating gun violence. For Traywick's family, the impact is profound and immediate. He leaves behind a wife and their 3 young children. Friends and community members have rallied around the family, launching a GoFundMe campaign to help with funeral expenses and the uncertain financial future they now face without Matthew's presence and support. As of early January, the fundraiser had almost raised well over 6 figures, a testament to the community's grief and support. This investigation is ongoing, with police urging anyone with information to come forward. This next case is out of Orange Park, Florida, and it involves 3 active duty Navy sailors stationed at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. And this tragedy occurred a week before Christmas Eve, 2025. According to Clay County Sheriff's Office reports, 22-year-old Petty Officer 3rd Class Tyler Lomax is accused of shooting and killing 21-year-old Noely Makenda and 20-year-old Jordyn Forrestier on Wednesday night, December 17, 2025. As of this recording, Lomax has been charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder and is being held without bond at the Clay County Jail. Deputies with the Clay County Sheriff's Office say that the events leading up to the shootings began earlier in the evening when Lomax's wife returned to the shared residence and became involved in a confrontation with Makenda and Forrestier. What started as a verbal dispute allegedly escalated both inside the home, and then it spilled out into the front yard. Officials report that during that confrontation, I guess it was like a verbal confrontation, it then turned into a physical altercation. So let's get this straight. Lomax, the male sailor who is now accused of a double homicide, his wife, and 2 female sailors were at their house. They were all allegedly roommates. The wife got into an argument with the 2 female sailors, and the husband was present. Whether he was involved or just an observer is unclear. At some point, Lomax retrieved a handgun and fired more than 30 rounds. 30 rounds, striking both women multiple times while they were in the front yard. Both victims were pronounced dead at the scene. Now, when I read that this sailor allegedly shot 30 rounds at 2 people, I was taken aback. I can't recall a story that I've covered where a person shot at someone that many times. And that's excluding, of course, mass shootings. Well, neighbors in the typically quiet Orange Park neighborhood described hearing the volley of gunfire, and they were equally shocked. One resident told reporters that the sound of that many shots was frightening and deeply unsettling for a community where this type of violence is rare. After the shooting, Lomax was arrested at the scene without incident. According to multiple local news reports, Lomax's wife, who had been present during the argument, called 911 to report the violence unfolding in the front of the home. In interviews with media at the scene, the woman identifying herself as Lomax's wife, she claimed that the shootings occurred in what she described as her husband's attempt to protect her during an altercation. She told reporters that she had been arguing with the 2 women and that the situation turned physical before Lomax fired his weapon. Quote, "Noely Makenda was the one that hit me in the face, and then they started jumping me. That's when my husband fired shots," end quote. And that's what the wife said in her account of the night's events to reporters. However, law enforcement officials have not confirmed the accuracy of the wife's claims, and the investigation remains active. Deputies have indicated that all evidence, including witness interviews and forensic results, will be reviewed as part of the ongoing probe. Additionally, in comments to local news outlets, Lomax's mother suggested that some details circulating in media accounts may be inaccurate or misleading, noting that reporters continue to investigate aspects of the night's events that maybe didn't happen. Now, his mom declined to elaborate further, citing her son's lack of legal representation. So, who were the victims? The 2 women killed in the shooting have been identified as Noely Makenda, 21, and Jordyn Forrestier, 20. Both women were active duty sailors serving in the Navy, and they were roommates of Lomax. According to military reporting, all 3 individuals were assigned to squadrons connected with NAS Jacksonville's aviation community, particularly units involving helicopters and maritime operations. Locally, community members remained shaken by the violence. Residents told reporters that they were grieving not only the loss of life, but the fact that such an event could happen so close to home in a neighborhood where children play and neighbors know each other by name. As of now, Tyler Lomax remains in custody without bond, and he is currently facing 2 counts of second-degree murder in the deaths of his 2 shipmates. The case is being handled by civilian authorities, but that could change, considering that both the victims and the perpetrator were members of the military. Now, this case will definitely be interesting to watch unfold, as the murders occurred on the lawn of the home of both victims and the perpetrator, meaning that they were all roommates. And this occurred in Florida. So how do stand your ground laws apply to people who live in the same household? I guess we shall see. For this next case, let's call it a cold case almost solved because it's still in the trial stages. And for this one, we are traveling further up the East Coast to New York. For nearly 3 decades, one of Long Island's most haunting cold cases sat unresolved. And it was the brutal 1997 killing of a young woman whose dismembered remains were found dumped in 2 separate locations and whose identity remained a mystery for decades. That mystery came to a shocking turning point in December of 2025, when authorities charged a Florida man who is a retired Army sergeant and ex-state trooper by the name of Andrew Dykes. They charged this man with second-degree murder in connection with the death of the woman now known as Tanya Jackson. What was once assumed to be potentially connected to the infamous Gilgo Beach serial killings has now taken a very different and deeply personal turn. But first, let me backtrack. In the summer of 1997, a torso was discovered in Hempstead Lake State Park on Long Island in New York. The remains, stored inside a green plastic container, were so badly mutilated that police could not identify the victim. They nicknamed her Peaches for a distinctive peach-shaped tattoo the woman had on her chest. For years, the torso, that's right, they only found the torso sat in evidence, unclaimed and unidentified, a grim component of Long Island's scattered homicide files. Then, in 2011, during a separate and very intense investigation into the notorious Gilgo Beach serial killings, which are a string of murders involving at least 10 victims whose bodies were found along the south shore of Long Island, additional remains were discovered. These remains included skeletal fragments and the body of a toddler girl later identified as Peach's daughter. Remember, Peach's torso was found in 1997, and her daughter's remains were found in 2011. Investigators dubbed the child Baby Doe. At the time, the proximity of these remains to the known Gilgo victims left open the very possibility that they might have been the work of the same serial killer. Both the woman and her child, however, would remain unidentified for decades. But these unnamed victims would finally get their names back on April 23, 2025. On that day, Nassau County Police announced that they had put names to the remains. Peaches was Tanya Jackson, a 26-year-old Alabama native and a veteran, and Baby Doe was her daughter, 2-year-old Tatiana Marie Dykes. Jackson had served in the U.S. Army from 1993 to 1995, and she and her daughter were living in Brooklyn at the time of their disappearance. The identification of Jackson and her daughter was itself a testament to modern forensic science, including familial DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, tools that simply were not available when the case first went cold. But that breakthrough would ultimately steer investigators to a name, and that name was Andrew Dykes. Andrew Dykes was listed on Tatiana's birth certificate as her father. On December 3, 2025, 66-year-old Andrew Dykes of Tampa, Florida, was arrested on a warrant out of Nassau County, New York, charging him with second-degree murder in the 1997 death of Tanya Jackson. Dykes was brought before a Florida judge but did not enter a plea at that time. He was eventually extradited to New York. In subsequent proceedings in Mineola, New York, Dykes pled not guilty to the charge of second-degree murder. Now, I did want to mention that the reports conflict as to whether Dykes has been charged with the murder of 2-year-old Tatiana, so I'm just going to leave it at that. But listen, you're probably wondering, how is this man, Andrew Dykes, connected to the victims besides the fact that he is the child's father? Well, prosecutors allege that Andrew Dykes, at the time a member of the Army back in 1997, met Jackson while serving together. Dykes was married, but they had an affair, and Dykes fathered a child with Jackson, and that was Tatiana. Jackson apparently wanted to actually be with Dykes, but he was married, and she was his dirty little secret, I guess. So he allegedly killed her and the baby and then continued on with his life. A critical piece of evidence in this cold case breakthrough, though, comes from DNA. Prosecutors say they obtained a DNA sample from Dykes by collecting a discarded drinking straw from a Tampa restaurant, which later matched genetic material found in evidence from Jackson's body. Now, all of that allowed authorities to tie a decades-old homicide to a suspect, all through the use of modern science. During a press conference after his arrest, the prosecutor said that when Dykes was questioned about Tanya and Tatiana's disappearance and murder, he said he didn't know that they were dead. He claimed he made various attempts to look for them over the years. Dykes' defense attorney has signaled that the defense will challenge the DNA evidence, asserting that new technology testing remains subject to scrutiny and challenge. The lawyer also described Dykes as a man who led a life that many would respect in law enforcement and the military, and emphasized that the case will hinge on how the forensic evidence is interpreted in court. Since his arrest, the Army did confirm that Dykes served in the Army as a medical sergeant from October of 1980 until his retirement in February of 2001. He then went on to become a Tennessee state trooper, and he worked for the state for 15 years. Through my own personal online sleuthing, I found that Dykes does have 2 sons with his wife, and his 43-year-old son did make a statement to the media. He told the media that he cannot believe his father would do what he is accused of doing. This son even said that the family was actually aware of Tanya and Tatiana. Dykes' wife allegedly found out about the affair, and she also found out about Tatiana on the day that Tatiana was born. And the son went on to say that the military was also aware of Tatiana because the little girl was covered by military health insurance. This son also revealed that there may have been another affair and child born out of a different affair that his father had around the same time that Tatiana was born. Of his father, his 43-year-old son said, quote, "He's a teddy bear, my dad. It's just not possible. I can't even imagine something like this being done by him," end quote. He spoke with his father after he was arrested, and Dykes said that he has a feeling they've been wanting to pin this on him ever since he voluntarily spoke with authorities last year, and that they are just trying to see what sticks. This poor grieving son ultimately told the media, quote, "There were no secrets when it came to my dad. He was just bad at being faithful in a marriage, but that's not a crime. It's morally wrong, but it's just not a crime," end quote. Now, everyone, that is all I have to report on that case. But I promise you, I am going to be following this case closely and will hopefully bring you the trial outcome in a full, independent episode when it's available. This next case is making history. In an unusual intersection of crime, legislative action, and military history, the remains of a Vietnam War veteran suspected in a string of violent crimes are set to be disinterred from a U.S. military cemetery more than 4 decades after he was buried there. That veteran is Fernando Cota, a man described by lawmakers as a convicted rapist and prime suspect in the murders of 5 women, whose burial among honored service members has become a point of national controversy and legal correction. Cota was born on June 20th, 1946, and he was drafted into the U.S. Army in the mid-1960s. That's when he served during the Vietnam War and attained the rank of sergeant. After his return from Vietnam, however, his life took a darker and ultimately a criminal turn. In 1975, while living in El Paso, Texas, Cota was convicted of binding and raping a nurse, a violent crime that resulted in a 20-year prison sentence. Although he was required to register as a sex offender at the time, he was released and he did not register. Cota was paroled in 1983, and he soon moved to San Jose, California, where he lived near San Jose State University and worked as a computer programmer. Reports from the period describe him as exhibiting very strange behavior toward women, though none of those accounts led directly to an arrest at the time. The chain of events that would make Cota one of the most disturbing criminal suspects in California history unfolded in October of 1984. On October 14, 1984, California Highway Patrol officers spotted Cota's white Chevrolet van driving erratically on U.S. Highway 101, and that was near San Carlos, California. When officers stopped the vehicle and asked to inspect the van, Cota instead shouted, "Kill me, kill me," and then he proceeded to fatally shoot himself with a handgun. Now, that was shocking in and of itself, but even more shocking was what they found inside the van. You see, inside the van, investigators found a wooden box containing the body of 21-year-old Kim Marie Dunham. She was an employee of a hardware store who had disappeared just the day before. Dunham's corpse had been bound, beaten, raped, and strangled, her hands tied with a chain and rope, evidence that she had been the victim of brutal violence prior to Cota killing himself. But what police found next would linger in the minds of investigators for years. When they searched Cota's rented apartment, officers uncovered a small closet outfitted with braces for shackles and even a peephole, suggesting a space used to restrain and possibly torture victims. Inside the unit, they found fake ID cards, a false police badge, women's clothing, 6 pairs of women's shoes, and flyers offering roommates for rent, advertisements that Cota had posted at the nearby university. Now, I'm not sure about you, but this case is giving Leonard Lake vibes. If you haven't listened to my 2-part miniseries on those guys, go listen because it is such a freaky case. All right, let's continue with this case. Who are the suspected victims of Cota? Well, fingerprint analysis from that closet wall and the broader investigation linked Cota, at least circumstantially, to the deaths of 5 women who were killed in San Antonio between August and October of '84. Now, I already mentioned the first one, and that was Kim Dunham. But in addition to her, who was found in his van, the other women that he is suspected of killing are 21-year-old Kelly Ralston, a university student who was found stabbed to death in her rented apartment the day after another woman disappeared. And then there is 56-year-old Gwendolyn Hoffman, who went missing from her home on September 10th, and she was later found strangled in the trunk of her car. Then there's 19-year-old Lori Lee Miller, who disappeared in late September. She was later found strangled near a roadway. Finally, there's 29-year-old Teresa Linda Sunder, who went missing in mid-September and was later found dead in an abandoned house. I do want to note that there was another case, Tanya Jackson, who was initially considered as one of Cota's victims, but she was later ruled out. In each of the cases that I mentioned prior to that, the victims' bodies showed evidence of violent death, strangulation, stabbing, or beating. And although investigators were not able to definitively prove Cota committed each homicide, he was the prime suspect in all of them. Because Cota died by suicide at the time of his apprehension, he was never formally charged with any of the murders. The only conviction on his record remains that 1975 rape conviction, a crime for which he served time and was later released. Despite his criminal past, after his death, Cota was buried in the Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, Texas, and that was in 1984. And this is a location that is reserved for military veterans and their families. But that burial status has long been controversial, given the severity of his crimes and the suspicions surrounding multiple other unsolved murders. Well, in August of 2025, U.S. Senators John Cornyn and Ted Cruz from Texas introduced legislation as part of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2026, and they directed the U.S. Secretary of Veterans Affairs to disinter Cota's remains and remove them from the National Cemetery. This effort began at the urging of the son of one of Cota's suspected victims, who launched a petition demanding justice and the removal of Cota's burial among honored veterans. On December 22, 2025, that legislation was signed into law by President Donald Trump. Under the new statute, Cota's remains must be exhumed and relocated to a non-national cemetery or returned to his next of kin, with the Department of Veterans Affairs coordinating the process. Senator Cornyn explained the rationale behind the bill in a public statement. Quote, Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery is a sacred resting place for more than 170,000 respected veterans and their loved ones, and it would be a slap in the face to each one of them to allow Fernando Cota, a convicted rapist and alleged serial murderer, to remain buried among such heroes, end quote. Under current law, individuals convicted of certain serious crimes are barred from burial in national cemeteries, but those provisions were not in effect when Cota was interred in '84. The recent legislation retroactively addresses that gap, ensuring that Cota and his remains no longer share space with those honored for their service. No specific date has been announced yet for the exhumation, but officials expect that it will occur sometime in 2026 as the VA completes planning and logistical steps. This next story is out of Idaho, and it is shedding light on what federal prosecutors describe as a massive betrayal of trust within the veteran community, involving nearly $1.45 million in missing funds that were supposed to benefit military veterans, not line the pockets of one man. Now, this is not a murder case, but I did want to include it because it is a really crazy case. Now, the man at the center of this story is 56-year-old Charles Thomas Abrahamson. He's a veteran and a former leader of a prominent veterans organization. Abrahamson is now federally charged with wire fraud and tax fraud in connection with the disappearance of those funds. Abraham's case took a dramatic and very public turn in late 2025 when a federal grand jury in Boise, Idaho returned an indictment accusing him of orchestrating a years-long financial scheme that siphoned money from the Idaho American Legion, a nonprofit organization that provides services and support for military veterans and their families. The alleged scheme dates back to 2018 and continued through April of 2024, according to prosecutors. The indictment alleges that Abrahamson, who served in the U.S. Marine Corps and then the Idaho Army National Guard, held significant leadership roles, including adjutant and commander within the Idaho American Legion. In those capacities, this man had broad access to and control over the organization's financial accounts, and the government says he abused that trust for his very own personal gain. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Idaho, Abrahamson knowingly devised a plan to defraud the Legion and at least one other individual, making unauthorized transfers, ATM withdrawals, payments towards his own credit cards, and other personal expenditures using nonprofit funds. These transactions were allegedly carried out over a multi-year period while he oversaw finances for the veterans organization. The indictment also asserts that Abrahamson filed false tax returns for the years 2020, 2022, and 2023, underreporting his income while engaging in this alleged fraud. In total, the scheme is tied to at least $1,454,025 in unrecovered forfeitable property, meaning funds or assets identified in the indictment that prosecutors believe were improperly taken or used. Now, I am going to name some of the more troubling elements reported in the investigations. The first one is there was a $100,000 donation that was intended to establish a scholarship fund for vocational training and summer programs for veterans' kids, and that money was allegedly diverted. Abrahamson allegedly produced documents in February of 2024 suggesting that those funds were safely held between two accounts. But authorities are now saying that neither account was legitimate. 2. In one documented incident in March of 2020, Abraham is said to have used an ATM at a casino to withdraw $8,000 from an American Legion account for personal use, which included gambling. 3. Abrahamson also allegedly sold off real estate owned by the Legion, including a historic building in Haley, Idaho, and taking the sale proceeds without notifying or obtaining approval from other Legion leadership. At the time of the sale in March of 2023, that building's assessed value was nearly $890,000. Yet it sold for a whopping $92,000. Y'all, I am so confused right now. Veterans and community members have expressed deep disappointment and a sense of betrayal. One Legion official recounted how Abrahamson secured access to bank accounts of smaller posts under the guise of efficiency, only for many of those posts to suffer significant losses once the scheme began to unravel. In early January of 2026, Abrahamson appeared in federal court in Florida, where he now resides, and pled not guilty to the charges, maintaining his innocence as the case moves forward. An attorney for Abrahamson has not publicly commented in detail, but the not guilty plea means that the prosecution must now prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt in a federal courtroom. Abrahamson's criminal case is being prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Idaho, and he is expected back in court in Boise at a later scheduled date as pretrial matters proceed. Now, if convicted on the federal charges, Abrahamson faces up to 20 years in prison on the wire fraud counts and up to 3 years on the tax fraud counts, as well as potential restitution orders to repay the victims of the alleged scheme. Sentencing would be determined by a federal judge after considering the U.S. sentencing guidelines and statutory factors. Now, I know that this is not a murder case or a violent crimes case, but betraying a community entrusted with supporting those who served is despicable. For veterans who rely on organizations like the American Legion for camaraderie, financial support, healthcare advocacy, and scholarships, such a loss reverberates far beyond a balance sheet. Prosecutors are now alleging that funds intended to help fellow service members and their families were instead diverted for personal benefit, undermining trust in an institution meant to honor military sacrifice. This story also serves as a reminder that no organization, even one rooted in veteran service, is immune from exploitation, and it highlights the importance of financial oversight, accountability, and transparency in all nonprofit operations. True Crime Army, I love you guys. Please remember, be wise, be vigilant, and make good choices. I truly appreciate you coming here today to listen to this Headlines episode. If you're digging these headline episodes, let me know. Rate the show 5 stars, leave me some kind words as a review, whatever it takes, message me. I want to know how you feel about these. And if you want to support the show in other ways, check out my bonus content. I have various tiers, but for as little as $5 a month, you have access to 60 full-length bonus episodes to binge on. And if you hate ads, guess what? Patreon has 0 ads. That means that you can sign up right now, pay $5, and listen to over 300 episodes with 0 ads. How can you sign up? Visit patreon.com/militarymurder and sign up today. All right, everyone, that is all I have for today. I'll start my list for next month's Headlines episode, but really, I am praying for 0. I am praying for 0 new cases. I want everyone to live a happy, healthy, and prosperous life. My sources for today's cases include federal indictments, Department of Justice press releases, and articles by Army Times, Stars and Stripes, KXXV, KMBT, Boise Daily News Now, Bonner County Daily Bee, Fox 4 News Dallas Fort Worth, Senator Cornyn's website, ABC News, CBS News, The Independent, KPTV, Action News, JAX, WJXT, WTOC, and The New York Post. Military Murder is a Mama Margot production. The music was created by Ty-Obs. Until next time, remember, you never really know what someone is capable of, so remain vigilant always. You have a fabulous week, and I'll keep digging to bring you another military murder story next time.
Mama's working on her podcast. I don't want to.